The story of the atomic bomb and its devastating impact on Japan during World War II is one of the most harrowing and transformative events in human history. The Japanese military, like much of the world at the time, could never have anticipated the sheer power and destructive capability of the weapon that the United States had secretly developed. What began as an unimaginable theoretical concept quickly became a brutal reality that altered the course of the war and the world forever. The development of the atomic bomb was a closely guarded secret, hidden away in the sprawling, heavily fortified research facilities of the Manhattan Project. By the summer of 1945, after years of tireless effort, scientific breakthroughs, and dangerous experimentation, the bomb was ready to be used. On the 6th of August, 1945, the world witnessed the unimaginable as the first atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. The explosion, equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT, obliterated nearly everything in its immediate vicinity, turning the city into a hellish landscape of fire and destruction. The blast, visible from miles away, was the culmination of a power that no one, not even the most senior military leaders of Japan, could have fathomed. For the Japanese military, it was a moment of disbelief. The bomb was unlike anything they had ever encountered. They were accustomed to devastating air raids and bombings. But the sheer scale of the destruction unleashed by the atomic bomb was beyond their wildest imagination. The bomb left behind no traditional signs of attack, no crater, no conventional debris, just a city reduced to dust. The heat, the radiation, and the shockwave from the explosion were unlike any weapon they had ever faced. Japanese soldiers and officers stationed in Hiroshima that fateful day were left in shock, unable to fully comprehend the nature of the attack. The atomic bomb left a haunting legacy, not just in terms of its immediate impact, but in the psychological toll it took on those who survived. The military leadership, still reeling from the catastrophic bombing, found itself scrambling to understand the new kind of warfare that had just been unleashed. It was clear that Japan was facing an enemy that had the power to annihilate entire cities with a single weapon. Just 3 days later, on the 9th of August, 1945, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. The Japanese military, already devastated by the bombings, was in a state of paralysis. The bombings left them with no choice but to face the harsh reality that Japan could not win this war. The Japanese military, once proud and confident in its ability to repel any invasion, now had to confront the terrifying reality of nuclear warfare. The shockwave from the atomic bombings reverberated not just through Japan, but through the entire world. The Japanese military, which had once been so focused on maintaining the upper hand through traditional military tactics, was forced to grapple with the new reality. The power of the atomic bomb had shifted the balance of the war, and the Japanese military, unable to match the destructive power of the United States' new weapon, was left with little option but to surrender. The surrender of Japan on the 15th of August 1945 marked the end of World War II. It was a moment of immense relief for the world, but it also left a haunting legacy that would change the nature of warfare forever. The Japanese military, devastated by the bombs and unable to comprehend the full extent of the devastation, was forced to confront the consequences of a weapon of mass destruction that had forever altered the global landscape. The initial disbelief within the Japanese military high command was not just a reaction to the sheer physical devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a profound realization that they had entered a new era of warfare, one that they had not prepared for, one that defied the traditional rules of engagement. Before the bombs dropped, Japan had already suffered heavy air raids from the United States. Cities had been reduced to rubble from conventional bombings, and there were growing fears about the increasing frequency of these attacks. But the atomic bomb was different. It didn't just destroy a building or a military target. It wiped out an entire city with an explosion so intense that survivors faced radiation poisoning and the lingering threat of death for years to come. Japan's military leaders had been trained to resist invasion through traditional tactics and preparation, but nothing could have prepared them for this. As the survivors in Hiroshima and Nagasaki faced the horrors of radiation sickness, burns, and broken bodies, the Japanese military was left scrambling to process the true implications of this new weapon. It was a weapon of mass destruction that could not be stopped, evaded, or defended against. The Japanese military, who had relied so heavily on the belief that they could fight with superior tactics and honor, suddenly faced the reality of an enemy that could destroy them in an instant. The United States did not stop at the initial bombings. The shockwave from Hiroshima and Nagasaki sent ripples through the global community. For Japan, it was clear that they could not hold out much longer. The concept of killing in numbers, a traditional aspect of military strategy, was no longer enough. The bomb had shown that war had taken on a completely new dimension. The Americans had unleashed a power that had no equivalent in the history of human conflict. Japan's leadership struggled with the moral and psychological toll the bombings caused. The realization that they were outmatched by a weapon of such destructive power forced Japan's military and civilian leaders to consider an unprecedented course of action. For weeks, the high command debated, but the strategic and moral considerations weighed heavily. They were aware that continuing the war could lead to the complete destruction of their nation, but the decision to surrender was something that had to be approached delicately. Honor was a critical part of the Japanese military code, and surrendering after being struck by such an overwhelming force would be seen as an ultimate defeat. In the days following the bombing of Nagasaki, Japan's military leaders held tense meetings to assess their options. The Emperor Hirohito, a symbolic but highly respected figure, was consulted on the matter. He understood the magnitude of the new weapon and the implications it had on the future of warfare. Ultimately, he made the decision to initiate the surrender process. On the 15th of August 1945, Japan formally announced its surrender, ending the Second World War. The signing of the instrument of surrender on the 2nd of September 1945 aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay marked the official end of hostilities. For the Japanese military, the atomic bomb represented not just a tactical defeat, but a deep psychological blow. The military leaders who had once believed in the superiority of their army, their strategic thinking, and their unyielding resolve were now forced to reckon with a force that had obliterated their capabilities in one swift moment. They could no longer rely on the traditional methods of combat that had once been so successful. In the aftermath of the war, the full implications of the atomic bomb continued to reverberate across Japan. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, known as hibakusha, became living witnesses to the horrors of nuclear warfare. For the military, the atomic bomb was a harsh reminder that the balance of power in the world had shifted irrevocably. Japan's military had been defeated not by soldiers, but by a weapon whose destructive potential was beyond comprehension. The story of the atomic bomb's impact on Japan is a tragic and sobering one. It serves as a reminder that, while weapons may change the tide of wars, they also change the fabric of humanity. The fear and devastation felt by the Japanese military in the face of America's atomic bomb were mirrored by the global fear that nuclear warfare would forever alter the nature of conflict. This story is not just about a weapon of mass destruction. It is a story about how humanity was forced to confront the terrifying potential of its own inventions and the lasting scars that still affect the world today. The story of the atomic bomb and its devastating impact on Japan during World War II is not only one of immense destruction, but also one of psychological trauma, disbelief, and an abrupt end to what had seemed like an unyielding military empire. For the Japanese military, the notion of an invincible weapon was simply outside their comprehension. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki left an indelible mark, reshaping their perception of war, power, and the future of conflict. Before the atomic bomb was unleashed, the Japanese military had witnessed heavy conventional bombing raids over several years of the war. Major cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe had been reduced to rubble by incendiary bombs and airstrikes. Yet, despite the devastating effects of these raids, the Japanese military remained resolute. There had always been a belief that Japan's spirit and the might of their military strategies would ultimately prevail, even in the face of overwhelming odds. But on the 6th of August 1945, when the atomic bomb, named Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima, the Japanese military was left in disbelief. The bomb, packed with the destructive power of 15 kilotons of TNT, wiped out over 90% of the city within seconds. The scale of destruction was beyond anything the Japanese had prepared for. Entire blocks vanished in an instant. The intense heat from the explosion caused fires that spread uncontrollably, engulfing buildings and people alike. The radiation sickness that followed added another layer of horror, with survivors dying from internal injuries and long-term effects. The bomb's devastating force created a surreal reality for the survivors, known as hibakusha. They were left disoriented, unable to comprehend what had just happened. What was once a thriving, bustling city had been turned into a wasteland of ruins and charred remains. For the Japanese military officers in Hiroshima, many of whom had experienced battles and air raids throughout the war, this was an entirely new type of warfare. One that was incomprehensible, a force that no conventional military tactics could counter. As news of the attack spread, Japan's military leadership began to understand the magnitude of the destruction. But even then, it was difficult for them to fully grasp the technology behind the weapon. They had seen devastation before, but this was something new. The bomb did not leave behind a typical crater. It did not destroy in a way that was immediately visible. Instead, it vaporized entire structures, turning concrete, steel, and people into nothing but ash. What remained was a poisoned land, tainted by radiation, making it impossible for anyone to live there for a long time. In the days following Hiroshima, Japan's leadership was thrown into a state of uncertainty. The Emperor Hirohito, despite his revered position as the symbol of Japan's unity, was cautious. The Japanese military leaders, many of whom were reluctant to consider surrender, still believed that Japan could fight on. The emperor's role in Japan's military strategy had always been crucial. And now, his decision regarding whether or not to accept defeat was the crux of Japan's future. But even he was unprepared for the unprecedented threat that had just been unleashed on his country. 3 days later, on the 9th of August 1945, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb, this time on Nagasaki. The immediate death toll was around 40,000, but the long-term effects would take the lives of tens of thousands more. As radiation sickness spread and the survivors struggled to cope with the physical and psychological trauma, the bomb at Nagasaki, named Fat Man, was more powerful than the first. And like Hiroshima, it left a wake of destruction that was hard to comprehend. As Japan reeled from the aftermath, the Japanese military leadership, though still in disbelief, began to recognize that they could not continue the war. The military, once confident in their ability to hold out against the Allied forces, now had to grapple with the reality that they had no defense against this new weapon. The once insurmountable strength of their air force, their naval fleet, and their ground forces now seemed irrelevant in the face of such overwhelming destruction. This was not a bomb that could be countered with conventional warfare or through a long-standing military blockade. This was a new age of war, one where entire cities could be annihilated in the blink of an eye.